In this episode of Plants of the Gods, join Dr. Mark Plotkin in conversation with mycologist and founder of the Fungi Foundation, Giuliana Furci. Giuliana and Dr. Plotkin discuss her experiences in the field of mycology and the new species of fungi she discovered, Psilocybe stamatzi.
There's a great new book out by Jeremy Narby, an indigenous collaborator, comparing the use of tobacco and ayahuasca, both separately and as companion plants, which I highly recommend. I'll put the reference in the show notes, but it's really very good, very readable. So I want to transition with hearing about your great discovery in the cloud forests of Northwest Ecuador. So if you could share that story with us.
Oh, it's a great one. So at the end of last year, my father passed away, and it was a very traumatic event because the circumstances of his death were quite traumatic, and there was a lot to do. So I had cancelled almost all my all my commitments except for one, which was a trip to Los Cedros Biological Reserve, which is a cloud forest and an area protected under rights of nature, the Ecuadorian Constitution, with British author Robert Macfarlane, who has written several incredible books, which I highly recommend, like Underland and The Old Ways and others. And he's doing research for a new book called Is the River Alive? And this was one of the places where he was going to go and look at rights of nature. And he invited me to go with him, and musician Cosmo Sheldrake went as well and was recording the soundscape of the place, and a lawyer. And we ended up going, a lawyer from New York, Cesar Rodriguez Garavito, and we ended up going to this reserve with the courts, with the constitutional judges from the Constitutional Court of Ecuador that wrote the sentence to save the place under rights of nature. So it was a very special trip. And as I was leaving, a colleague of mine, Bryn Dentinger, writes to me and said, Julie, I've got collections of 2 new species of Psilocybe from Los Cedros. Can I send you some photos so that you look at them? He collected them 11 years before. Like, can you just take a look at them? You're going in the dry season. There's no chance you're going to find them, but just take a look and see what happens. So I, look at these mushrooms, sort of really soak them in, and went on this trip, which was basically a trip to revive. For me, it was revival. I was, coming out of one of the most traumatic, event of my life. And as we're walking through the forest, we've gone, with these judges. They all knew I was on the lookout for these 2 species, and I had sort of shown them, and there wasn't a mushroom in sight, and the ground was crunchy dry. And suddenly we're walking down from a waterfall. There are like 6 people in front of me, and I looked to one side, and there was one of them, Psilocybe. And I look, and I'm like, there she is. It was just incredible. There was no other mushroom in sight, and that was the first encounter. Got down, collected, immediately recognized it as one of the Psilocybe that Bryn Dentinger had asked me to collect again, because he only had one collection from 11 years before. And then, a few days later, I was walking through the forest again with a smaller group. The judges had left, and suddenly I got the feeling, it's a very profound feeling in this crunchy, dry forest, that the Psilocybe was there. And I thought to myself, should I say it? Should I not say it? Should I say it? And I just blurted it out. And I said to everyone, I feel it's here. And, we walk a few steps, and boom, there appears the mushroom, the second Psilocybe, which turned out not to be a Psilocybe. That's the spoiler to the story. But the first one that we encountered, immediately, as soon as we realized it was Psilocybe, Bryn and I decided to dedicate the species to Paul Stamets. Paul Stamets is an extraordinary mycologist who has never been honored with the name of a species. And many people might not know, but he wrote incredible books teaching how to cultivate. He wrote Psilocybin Mushrooms of the World, an incredible book that, just really set the stage for understanding where and who these organisms were. And in my case, personally, it was through him that I could understand that there was a way forward in life, being completely enamored with mushrooms. And so we decided to dedicate the species to him, silently worked, wrote up the species, the microscopy, the genetics, really understood that it was new and unique. And then after we published the species, got on a Zoom call with him to tell him of the story, which is, he was actually very, very surprised and overwhelmed, I'd say. Yeah.
There's a lot of people very appreciative of you doing that, and that was long overdue.
It was long overdue, wasn't it? That was the feeling,
Totally long overdue.
Absolutely. And of the two mushrooms that were found on that trip, both were these, they're from the psilocybe group. One is, and it's a Protostropharia, but that one psilocybe, so special, so unique in a place that's protected, and just also for me, it was really important because I was, coming back to life after losing my father. And in some way, and I've never even said that to Paul, actually, in some way, he's, Pablo doesn't know that he has been a father figure in mycology for me. I met him 18 or more years ago, close to 20 years ago, when I was, on a quest to understand what I could do for the fungi. And he just made sure that he said, whatever you do, it's going to be great. Go for it. Yeah.
He's inspired the career of many people and turbocharged many people's lives. So I want to refer back to the film Fantastic Fungi, in which he's essentially the protagonist. You're in there as a co-star. It really is a
30-second cameo.
A brilliant documentary. And I want to talk a little bit about non-hallucinogenic mushrooms, medicinal mushrooms, because mushrooms are certainly having a moment. The Last of Us is one of the most popular TV series in the country here in the U.S. I'm sure you're deluged by people saying, can they do that to humans? And
also the Chilean protagonist.
Well, exactly. But I prefer, instead of saying, no, they only do it to insects, just to say you just have to be careful because you never know with fungi. Yeah. And in doing the research for a recent paper I did, it just reiterated the fact that, antibiotics were not discovered by Alexander Fleming. The ancient Egyptians, the ancient Hebrews, the ancient Aztecs, the ancient Chinese were all using moldy stuff to treat infections. And in fact, when Fleming came forth, I think 1929, there are all these English midwives going, he didn't find anything. Look, moldy bread, I keep it on the windowsill. So yeah. Fungi have been part of our ethnopharmacopoeia forever. Going back to the Iceman, Otzi, 5,000 years ago, he had fungi on a strap, one of which was kindling, one of which was medicinal. There it is. So talk a little bit about that for us, please.
There's no doubt that humans have culturally co-evolved with fungi. And I say culturally co-evolved because in evolutionary terms, co-evolution, strictly, evolutionary biology, it means something else. We could also discuss that, but we have the existence, the way we live, the fact that we live is due to the actions of fungi. When life emerges from an aquatic ecosystem to conquer land, plants do that by teaming up with fungi. Fungi do that by teaming up with plants in the form of lichen and other symbiotic organisms that emerge from aquatic to form soil that then gives way to the way we live today. If we look at fossil fuels, many of them are thanks to absence of decomposing fungi in some eras. The way we dress, how we eat, gut microbiomes, it's all dependent on the action of fungi. And in terms of cultural coevolution, what we see is that there are relationships between humans and fungi that have culturally co-evolved independently in different parts of the world. And at the Fungi Foundation, we've been mapping ancestral and traditional uses of fungi for a couple of years now. And what we can see is that uses such as the one that was unveiled with the discovery of Otzi the Iceman are true to different cultures in different parts of the world. So the Mapuche people in southern Chile also used conchs, polypore conchs, to start fires and to transport embers that were alight. We see giant puffballs being mixed with animal grease around the world in different parts of, arid strips of the planet with the same use, same medicinal uses. So Australia, North America, Colombia, and Chile, different places around the world. So there's not clarity of the order of events, but what is very clear is that humanity and fungi in an alliance give way to life as we know it today.
Well, in your interview with Tim Ferriss, you talked about the fact that people don't realize that fungi are more closely related to people than they are to plants. And I know on your expedition you had a sheldrake with you, but there is another sheldrake who wrote that great book, Entangled Lives. And let me read a quote from that because this touches on that. Quote, penicillin, a compound that could defend fungi from bacterial infection, turned out to defend humans as well. At a molecular level, fungi and humans are similar enough to benefit from many of the same biochemical innovations.
Yeah, that's Merlin.
Yes. So could you talk a little bit about that, about this commonality and what it means for the future?
Right. So the kingdoms, I do drop the G as much as I can, kingdoms of animalia, so animals, and kingdom the fungi, share a common ancestor. And that common ancestor is an organism that is one cell with a posterior flagellum. And we call it opisthoconta, or the opisthocons. Now, one cell with a posterior flagellum, to many might sound unknown, but to others may sound like the sperm cell, and they're absolutely right. So the sperm is an opisthocon, that lives today. And in the fungi, there are also organisms that have this one cell with a posterior flagellum. And from that organism starts a divergence in evolution, speciation, that gives way to organisms that have a cell membrane and that ingest and move, and other organisms that have a cell wall made out of chitin and that absorb. They live inside their food. They secrete enzymes. They digest outside of their body and then they absorb them back in. Those are the fungi. So animals have a cell membrane. They ingest. They mostly move. Fungi have this cell wall made out of chitin. They secrete enzymes. They digest outside their body and they absorb. That common ancestor, Opisthoconta, is quite recent. It's only a few billion years ago. And in evolutionary terms, not a few, hundreds, billions of years ago. But in evolutionary terms, it's quite close. And plants do not have that relationship with fungi. That has, an evolution and speciation has carried on traits, molecular traits that make us susceptible to compounds that fungi produce to protect themselves, but that are also useful to animals because of these commonalities coming from the common ancestor of Opisthoconta.
Well, you hit on a key point there, and that is the utility in animals. We tend to think about medicines, what's in it for us. But few people realize that the veterinary industry, that is drugs for cats and dogs, is worth $20 billion a year in the U.S. That's a big economy. And that mushrooms are part of that. I've been working with a holistic vet named Rob Silver, and he says that the future is almost unlimited in treating all sorts of pet ailments, from cancer to PTSD, using mushrooms like turkey tail and many others. And of course, the barrier is lower to approval of veterinary medicines and for humans. So this is yet another life-saving aspect of the fungal kingdom.
Yeah, fungal compounds are extraordinary, and fungi have the capacity to adapt. Yeast, for example, are used to study evolution because of the short generation length, because of the ways that they adapt and that they can reproduce. So they really are an extraordinary group of organisms that whose strategies to survive and thrive can be useful to animals, and ultimately that's what you're saying. That's how we need to say it, is they're not making it for us. No way.
Well, there's a quote I wrote down recently from our friend Chris Hobbs, who is first and foremost a mycologist, but also a clinical herbalist. So he knows his stuff. And I was asking him about fungi, and he said, quote, "Fungi are increasingly proving to be effective in the lab and the clinic for the prevention, support, and treatment of cardiovascular issues, metabolic syndrome, respiratory problems, stress, and overall immune response, as well as increasing energy and improving cognition." And that's one-stop shopping.
Well, and imagine, I mean, statins that are used to lower cholesterol all come from fungi. Medicines used to tolerate, transplants, organ transplant come from fungi. And there are so many compounds that are synthesized from fungi that most people have no idea about. Even in the mining industry, the process of biolixiviation, where fungi are used to get more metal out of the rock. And, they're used, the biotechnological applications of fungi in aspects of everyday life are endless.
Statins are a $1 billion drug class, and I've never met a physician who prescribed statins who knew that they came from fungi.
Really? Wow. That says it.
But one of the great stories about fungi as medicines is even medicines that come from plants actually come from fungi. So Taxol's a $1 billion drug, and guess what? It doesn't come from the yew tree. Where does it come from?
Yeah, it comes from a fungus.
Exactly.
There are so many. And, going back to your question about Lewis Carroll as well, I think it's important to go back to how these, ancestral and traditional uses came to the old world when it was the new world. Because let's remember that what we call the old world was once the new world in light of other areas. I think there's also an important fungus to mention, and it's ergot. And and we were talking about Albert Hofmann before, but it might be interesting for the listeners to understand how LSD and everything that LSD triggered from medicinal to other uses also comes from a fungus, but a fungus that is a parasite of grains that were used to make flour and then to make bread. And there are several accounts of these mass intoxications and of ergotism, in whole villages, because they were eating bread made from rye that was infected with ergot and effectively LSD. And I think that there's also, there's a lot to say about how fungi have been looked at in history because of ergotism and what was produced in people.
Are you familiar with Brian Morarescu and his book, The Immortality Key?
Yes.
Okay, I had Brian on the program. It was very popular. And he was trying to test Carl Ruck and Gordon Wasson's thesis that the Eleusinian mystery, that is the fundamental ceremony of ancient Greece, was due to ergot. And, of course, with new methods, he was able to find actual artifacts that were full of ergot, even a jawbone that had ergot between the teeth. So he proved Ruck correct. When Ruck came up with this in the 70s, he was almost drummed out of academia. But the reason I mention this is because Glenn Shepard, who's also on Plants of the Gods, found 7 ergot-like alkaloids in piri piri, which was the ginseng of the Amazon. So this ergot story alone is worth a book. And if you don't write it, I'm sure somebody will, because there's so much to it. And it's still unfolding.
It needs it. It's still there. I mean, it's a story that hasn't been told. And I think that, it could prove to be a missing link in a way. Let's think about it. Ergot was used also in, birthing process, in pregnancies, in women. I mean, there are ancestral and traditional uses that are very, very potent and very important in the history of humanity. And that story, I think does deserve to be told.
Well, I look at ergot as one of these entheogenic scalpels. They can heal and they can hurt. And that duality is overlooked by many people in the Psychonaut community who think that, there's no downside to buying ayahuasca off the internet and trying it at home. I mean, we had Hamilton Morris on. There's a new syndrome of people who smoke too much dope having these terrible health problems.
Yeah.
So these
because dope isn't what it used to be either. I mean, I think we're also in this new era of molecular enhancement of certain things. It's harder and harder to find to get to the source, the genetic source. Yeah.
Well, when I was a kid, we used to smoke 3 joints to try and catch a buzz. Now I take 2 hits and I get heart palpitations. So I guess it's definitely changed over time. But let's give props to Raphael Mechoulam, the Bulgarian scientist who passed away last week, who figured this all out. And that's a life story worth a book as well, escaping the Nazis by going to village in rural Bulgaria in the 40s, and then migrating to Israel and finding out this thing that Hoffman himself couldn't figure out, like what the hell was in this stuff and how did it work in the human brain. So this whole issue of what you learn about the human brain, the human nervous system, by investigating these mind-altering substances and these poisons, I wrote about this in my book, Medicine Quest, is another positive therapeutic aspect to all of these compounds. And, the story is endlessly fascinating. So I want to continue this conversation in another interview because there's so much to go on. But I want to wind down. I want to ask about the great inspiration you received from another mutual friend of ours, which is Jane Goodall. I wonder if you'd share that with us.
Oh, Jane Goodall. Wow. I mean, my bond with her, I would have to say, comes from, I think, motherhood, being mothers, working in the field. I met Jane Goodall here in Chile over a decade ago, and gifted her first field guide to Chilean mushrooms I'd written, and she took the book and she was like, this is incredible, and wanted to hear a bit more about my story. And somebody there had told them, this Giuliana and the foundation, and there's nobody else really talking about fungi. And she came up to me very spontaneously and said, don't stop. You're with mushrooms where I once was with the chimps, and don't stop. Keep going. And those words resonated so heavily that the second time I met her, when I got back home from a trip one day, she had already left Chile, and there was this envelope delivered to my house where she'd written me a handwritten letter, apologizing in a way for not having included fungi in her latest book. But by the time she'd met me, she'd already written it. And so it was a very humbling experience of meeting a woman, who had done so much for a species or for a family of animals, being empathetic with, 40 years later with somebody who's on a quest for a kingdom of life. And she was just, her words of saying not to stop were important. And then the second time I met her, we talked a bit more about motherhood and what it is to be a field scientist, having a child and being single mothers. So I have a 16-year-old son who was born to a mother field mycologist, and and we've both have had to live through that, but also in my case carrying the stigma of being in a Latin American country where you're in the field and somebody's like, and who's looking after your child? And I'm like, what do you mean who's looking after my child? Who's looking after him? I'm like, well, he's with his dad, nobody's looking after him, and his father is a cinematographer, and nobody would dare ask him who's looking after his son when he's out filming a movie, even for months. And so just living through that stigma, social stigma. And in my case, I think more a cultural stigma of being a mother in the field, and the sort of trade-off between doing something that you were born to do, and at the same time, being in charge and being the lifeline to a human, to another human. And our bond is very much was born from there. And then in 2018, when I published the second field guide, she was very generous to write, a review for the back cover, along with Paul Stamets. Both of them wrote, but always in support of this, this woman who's doing something that I think what she recognized is that I was seeing and feeling something that nobody else was, but I was so sure that they would at some point. And it was similar to what she went through with the chimps. She was seeing something that the world had to know, but the world still couldn't see, and she didn't stop until they did. And that's communion. It's communion.
Well, I have the great good fortune of going drinking with Jane in a few nights, so I will share that update with her. And like Stamets, she's inspired many of us. and will continue to do through her films and our books.
Yeah.
But here's my wish as we conclude. I wish that people will support your organization. Look it up as ffungi.org on the net. I'll put it in the show notes. And here's hoping that the world appreciates these efforts and that one day we'll be having a drink to celebrate the fact that Jane Goodall, Paul Stamets, and Giuliana Furci have all received the Nobel Prize for their important
Thank you. Thank you. Well, if they get it, then that means we've got it.
If you've enjoyed this podcast, please remember to give us a good rating and to subscribe and share with like-minded folks. We appreciate your support for the protection of the knowledge and biodiversity of South America by the Amazon Conservation Team.